So I know that I'm going to make a lot of Scottish nationalists very, very angry. But before we go into this article, hear me out on this. Look, I've got no skin in this game. I'm from Yorkshire. But I have friends in Edinburgh, I have friends in Aberdeen, and I am fully aware of, what goes on in Scotland. Not 100%, clued into everything that's going on in Holyrood, anything like that. But I can tell you this: whenever I've been to Scotland, I don't know how it happens, but I end up getting bombarded by Facebook ads from Scottish nationalists and recommended Scottish nationalist like blogs and things like that, and I read them, and I'm very shocked by the amount of reliance on lies. Essentially, the lies that Scotland is somehow the current slogan is bigger, stronger, richer, and that's their current slogan for Scottish. That they're using to try and drum up support for independence. But the more I look at the ideas that they propose and purport to do, the less the sound they're based on. And to be honest, coming from someone who is against Brexit, it is very hard. If I was in Scotland, it would be very hard for me to try and square away the fact that in the Scottish independence referendum, the SNP, and quite significantly, really up until and as far as I'm aware, it's still on their manifesto. At least as far as I'm aware, it was. The Scottish nationalist idea was to break away from the UK and then not join the EU, in their words, to pave the way for other countries to show that it is possible to live outside the EU. And that was their grand plan. And to be honest, kind of shocks me that a lot of people, when you're talking about the SNP and their policy on that, can't see this huge U-turn away from the sky. That should be obvious. The other one, of course, is their reliance on, there's oil in the North Sea, we can live off that. Well, okay, explain to me if you're going to survive off North Sea oil, and that's going to bring huge boon to your new country. Explain to me how the North Sea oil, first of all, BP haven't drilled any new wells in there for quite a significant time now, because there's no point going for it. It's either too deep and too expensive to extract, or it's just not worth going for it. You've also got to explain how the Norwegian oil industry, which is 2 times smaller than the North Sea Scottish-based industry, makes more money than the Scottish oil industry. Again, doesn't make sense. And we could go on about a lot of these things that the Scottish nationalists throw about as ideas. And I'll say this now: if Scotland goes and votes independence, doesn't really bother me at all. But as someone who is currently, fighting against a very, very proto-nationalist ideas in against the Brexiteers, who have produced nothing but lies, and honestly, you could change the word Britain to Scotland in some of these, and they sound very similar to the rhetoric coming from the Scottish nationalists. But there you go. But I'm sure that's still going to enrage people. And oh, by the way, your country or potential country might have a problem when my own county of Yorkshire has a stronger case for independence than Scotland's. Again, I don't really want to bash on you guys, but you're telling things and they don't add up. And for someone who, again, as I say, fighting against people who are doing exactly the same, doesn't seem to be a very honest way of going about arguing for independence. So, this comes from Prospect Magazine. So, whatever the result in Scotland, there is no reason for another independence referendum. So, when I was Secretary for State for Scotland in Margaret Thatcher's cabinet, there was a lament of the often heard from Labour and the SNP politicians that poor Scotland was doomed to live under a Tory government because of the way the English had voted. There is a splendid irony that since Theresa May lost her majority at the last general election, poor England has been forced to continue living under a Tory government because the Scots in 2017 increased the number of Scots Tory MPs from 1 to 13. Without these additional seats, May would have not had a majority in the House of Commons, even with the support of the Democratic Unionists from Northern Ireland. The reason why the Scots then bucked the trend elsewhere in the UK and transformed the Tories into the main opposition party, the SNP, was that the Scottish electorate refused to be preoccupied by Brexit either for or against. They may again be highly relevant in the current general election, which is certain to take that case against breaking up the United Kingdom is considerably more powerful than ever it was in 2015 or 17. Nicola Sturgeon has made it clear in 2017 that she is making clear now that if the SNP advance in a further general election, it would use it to demonstrate that Scots demand a new referendum on independence, despite the SNP having been roundly defeated in the 2014 independence referendum. Then, as now, a substantial majority of Scots, including a significant majority of SNP voters, did not want another referendum, the first one having divided families, communities, and Scotland as a whole in an increasingly bitter way. Many felt that the SNP would continually demand referendums on independence until eventually it won one. Then would not be referendums, but have become neverendums. Although the SNP appears strong today, there is no constant evidence that the Scottish public as a whole are any more enthusiastic for another independence referendum than they were 2 years ago. It is true that 62% of Scots voted to remain in the EU referendum, but, contrary to SNP hype, this does not demonstrate that there is a fundamental north-south divide in the United Kingdom. After all, the other part of the UK where 62% voted to remain was London, at the southern end of the kingdom. And of course, not only did 38% of Scots vote for Brexit, but this includes a substantial majority of SNP supporters who see being ruled by Brussels as being objectionable as being ruled by London and yearn for full independence like Switzerland or Norway. In one respect, the SNP is in a stronger position in this general election than it was 2 years ago. Ruth Davidson is no longer the leader of the Scots Tories and the leader of the opposition in Scotland. She has been a powerful figure in reinvigorating the Scottish Tories and considerably more impressive with the public than any other Scottish politician, including Sturgeon. It seems likely that the Tories will lose at least some of their 13 seats to the SNP, which will make the Prime Minister's target of an overall majority in Parliament more difficult to achieve. In any event, two things should be unmistakably clear. Whatever the result of a general election in Scotland, there is no case for another referendum on independence in the foreseeable future. At the time of the last one, Alex Salmond proclaimed that the vote would be a once-in-a-generation opportunity. That was a mere 5 years ago. Generations do not change that often. What is also clear is that there is every probability of the SNP would lose again. North Sea oil has virtually disappeared as a crucial asset that the independent Scots could use to balance the books. Such is the very high level of public expenditure north of the border, which is fueled by the UK government, that a separate Scotland would be left with no alternative than to either accrue interest in taxation or unprecedented cuts in public expenditure. During the last referendum, the SNP argued that Scotland could keep the pound even if it were no longer part of the UK. That unrealistic option has now been dumped in favour of a Scottish currency, which might lead to joining, lead to joining the euro, which will appeal to few Scots, especially such as a Scots currency, which would drop in value the day after the independence because of the precarious state of the Scottish economy without the subsidy from the south. There is also one final consideration that would be the nail in the coffin of the SNP. Assuming that the UK, including Scotland, had left the European Union, an independent Scotland would neither be in the EU single market nor in that of the remaining United Kingdom, in which a large majority of Scottish exports are sold. An independent Scotland was successful. If an independent Scotland was successful in joining the EU, it would become even worse. There would be a hard border between Scotland and England, and as that border would have become the external border between the EU and the UK, as the same with the border with Ireland and Ulster. So, what would be required? The need for an English backstop would dominate the diplomatic and economic exchanges for years thereafter. Remember, you heard it here first. And that was from Malcolm Rickford, and that's the Secretary of State for Scotland from 1986 to 1990. You know, you might want it, but there are consequences for being independent. And I have to ask the question of, can you deal with the consequences? Because to me, even if I was Scottish, looking at it from this way, it's just not worth it. and here's the thing, guys, if you want not to live under Tory rule, there's only one option for you to go for, and that's either to vote Labour or Lib Dem. Because the SNP aren't really going to deliver it for you. And I know that's riled up a lot of people, me just saying that, but there you go, that's the truth.